Abdallah Schleifer is the director of the Washington News Bureau of Arabiya and recently retired as distinguished lecturer in mass communications at the American University in Cairo, where he was also director of the Adams Center for Television Journalism. He was a veteran journalist who covered the Middle East for American and Arab media for more than 20 years, served NBC News radio correspondent, and was also the NBC News Cairo bureau chief. He's a visiting fellow at Oxford University and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Abdallah has been seen and heard in lots of different places, and despite having put himself in harm's way for a very long period of time, I must say that he's still a very nice guy. So without any further ado, I'd like to present Abdallah Schleifer to talk to us about the media and religion in the Arab Islamic world. Thank you.
Jacques Ellul, the French moral philosopher and sociologist, was not the first to observe that the phenomenal development of mass media has revolutionized politics. But his insight more than 30 years ago that the flood of information, of discontinuous facts, would overwhelm any effective understanding, any effective sense of historic context. And that's been borne out over the past few decades. Now more than ever, and to the degree that particular varieties of religion and politics have become so overtly intertwined, the lack of historic context is a massive problem, and the effect of media upon religion is greater than ever. Now here I stress the word overt, for I share the conviction of His Holiness Benedict XVI, not to mention T.S. Eliot, Peter Berger, and many others, that religion is always at the heart of any civilization, even if that civilization has gone into denial and spiritual eclipse, as seems to be the case in what appears to be a post-Christian Europe. So I think we have all gotten used to this dismal situation where the parade of facts usually lacks the vital context, and none more so than the context of religion. And if discontinuity in making sense out of the parade of facts that appear in respectable Western media is a problem, in much of the Arab Islamic world media, even the determination of what is a fact is a problem, much less the issue of discontinuity. And this is my first point. While discontinuity is a real problem for the Western media, it is compounded when you deal with media that have trouble determining basic fact. Let's take a current example. When Pope Benedict spoke earlier this month at Regensburg on faith, reason, and the university, it was Western media, our news agencies and newspapers, that seized upon one unfortunate paragraph. And the paragraph reflected a misconception on the part of the particular experts in Islamic studies that the Pope relies upon. In contrast, let us say, to the experts Pope John Paul II relied upon. The breaking story went with it as the story. In other words, this one unfortunate paragraph became the story, and not as an unfortunate phrase that fit into what the Pope saw as the profound coexistence between faith and reason in traditional Christianity, and which he did not see, correctly or incorrectly, within Islam. And indeed, there are any number of scholars, both non-Muslim as well as Muslim, who would contest that exclusivist point made by His Holiness, and some already have. But that's part of the point. This was not the Pope speaking ex cathedra, nor was this a new doctrine guiding relations with Islam to replace the Church's standing document, Nostra Aetate, which affirms the great commonalities between Islam and Christianity, commonalities that would amaze even many in this audience. This official papal document, Nostra Aetate, went on to note how practicing Muslims, quote, value the moral life, and worship God, especially through prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. But the Regensburg paper was an academic paper by a theologian, for theologians, arguing some points that many Muslim theologians would take issue with, and advancing at the same time an understanding of the militantly secular modern West that many of the same Muslim theologians no doubt share with the Pope. Instead, the quote, however unfortunate, was taken out of context, and by so doing quickly turned into some sort of papal insult and declaration of war against Islam. Now, the discontinuity in the initial stories that appeared in the Western press was intrinsic. First, in ignoring context, and secondly, in ignoring not just the official papal perspective on Islam and the extraordinary collaboration and dialogue between Muslims and Catholics set in motion by John Paul II, but also without any reference at all to Pope Benedict's remarks little more than a year ago when meeting in Cologne, Germany, with representatives of the Muslim communities. There in Cologne, Pope Benedict insisted that dialogue was not an option but a necessity, and that Catholics and Muslims must avoid past mistakes and seek paths of reconciliation. They must learn to live with respect for each other's dignity. Even the issue of a relationship between violence and Islam, which was an aside in this academic paper, had as its most direct commentary in Pope Benedict's own very recent words, commemorating the 20th anniversary of the interreligious meeting called Prayer for Peace. Prayer for Peace was initiated by John Paul II at Assisi in 1986. Now, those words of Pope Benedict, and they're very recent, and I quote them, quote, "Demonstrations of violence cannot be attributed to religion as such, but to the cultural limitations with which it is lived and develops in time," unquote. An observation as applicable to the massacres associated with the Crusades, applicable to the Almohad persecutions of non-Muslims in Muslim Spain, the compulsory conversions of Jews and Muslims that accompanied the Reconquista of Spain, the Cossack pogroms in honor of Easter, and as Charles Krautheimer recently acknowledged, in those rather gory passages in the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. Or for that matter, and now I'm clearly not quoting Charles Krautheimer, in the exhortations by extremist rabbis to ethnically cleanse Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza of all Arabs, be they Muslim or Christian. Then Pope Benedict went on to observe, quote, "Attestations of the close bond that exists between the relationship with God and the ethics of love are recorded in all great religious traditions." But despite our own journalistic attraction to conflict and confrontation, and our own immediate discontinuity from the background that should shape any story, and despite the secularist bias of so many of my colleagues that make a story like this such a delight, despite all of this, there are correctives in the Western press. The follow-up story, which often, if only out of professional ambition, attempts to develop an alternative narrative to the original breaking story. And then there is the op-ed column. So papal clarification, as well as intelligent analysis, found significant space in American and European media. And over the internet, ranging from the Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter, John Allen, who published an op-ed column in the New York Times, to a message to Pope Benedict from his beatitude, Ignatius IV, Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch and all of the East, in which the Patriarch recalls the Eastern Orthodox, quote, "knowledge, experience, and understanding of Christianity and Islam together, for they have been in a state of coexistence, cooperation, and harmony from the beginning of the Islamic mission until now," unquote. All right, allowing for some well-intended and poetic exaggeration, the Patriarch is alluding to the unbroken existence of large communities of indigenous Christians, and I would add, indigenous Jews up until 1947-48, throughout much of the Arab world. in contrast to the total absence of a Muslim presence in the Latin West following the fall of Andalusia and Sicily, and an often painful presence of Jews in the West until relatively modern times. But with rare exception, in the Arab world, once the state has spoken, there has been little turning back, as in the demagogic role of some Arab and Muslim states in a cynical overreaction, first to the Danish cartoon incident, which I'm sure you all remember, that preceded this latest, quote, Muslims versus the West media pump drama turned violent. Or once the so-called Arab street has spoken, there has been little turning back by Arab media to reevaluate a story. There has been little interest in most of the Arab press in going for more facts to a story than one paragraph taken out of context, and complete lack of significant reference to the prevailing facts of Catholic-Muslim relations over the past few decades. It's also significant that the two immediate violent episodes following the first press reports centering around that one paragraph, the murder of a nun and the torching of Catholic churches, occurred in two of the most lawless parts of the Muslim world, Somalia and the West Bank. The point, the most obvious point, and perhaps I should say the most absurd point about the violence in the Muslim world in response to the Pope's unfortunate quotation, and you know, even burning the Pope in effigy is metaphorical violence. So the most absurd point about it is that all of this violence is to protest against a Pope supposedly saying that Islam is violent. I must confess, Charles Krautheimer also noted the absurdity of that response in the same column I alluded to earlier. Now, I've never thought the day would come when I would quote Charles Krautheimer in such a favorable manner. But if I have to do so, it's best I do so at an event organized by the FPRI. This brings me to a second point. What facts do get reported are often curtailed by the confrontation line. In much of Arab Islamic world media, the problem isn't simply discontinuity between events and their factual reporting, but the very difficulty of getting any facts reported once a confrontational line is drawn, be it with Europe, the Pope, America, or obviously the State of Israel, or elements within Israel, who are then portrayed as the spokesman for a supposedly monolithic Israeli society. Let me mention as an example of my last allusion, the tendency of Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, a very popular sheikh who's closely associated with one of the Islamist movements. Now, that association is more significant in understanding his perspective than the fact that he's technically a graduate of Al-Azhar University, which has always been the seat of mainstream Islam opposed to the branches of militantly political Islamism. Sheikh Qaradawi's reach in the Arab world has been greatly enhanced by his regular appearance on Al Jazeera satellite news channel. Now, my critics will say that the negative remarks I'm about to make concerning Sheikh Qaradawi are self-serving, since the Arab satellite news channel I now work for, Al Arabiya, is the competition to Al Jazeera. So somewhere before this lecture is all over, I'm going to have to say something nice about Al Jazeera. On any number of occasions, when alluding specifically to some issue in the Arab-Israeli or Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Sheikh Qaradawi will allude to the Jews. Of course, in part this reflects the transformation of a clash that, however much religion may get involved in or be exploited, is nevertheless basically between two rival nationalisms, Arab and Israeli or Palestinian and Israeli, increasingly transformed into a total confrontation between two religions, Judaism and Islam, a perspective that has been popularized not just in Palestine, but throughout the Arab and Muslim world. And as always happens with extremist perspectives, this perspective of the clash as a total clash between two religions is absolutely mirrored by the ultra-right-wing religious nationalist forces in Israel and their supporters here in America. So anyway, as far as Sheikh Qaradawi is concerned, It's not just some Jews instead of some Israelis, it's the Jews. When I pointed out to Sheikh Qaradawi at a conference we both attended in Qatar a few years ago, organized by the Brookings Institution, that among the Jews were a few thousand peace activists, Israeli peace activists, who were risking their lives and their reputations as patriotic Israelis for the sake of the West Bank Arab villagers. These Palestinians, the West Bank Arab villagers, were being prevented by force, by terror, if you will, by terror, from harvesting their olive crops, prevented by the religious nationalist settlers who had attacked the villagers and their olive trees at harvest time. The Jews, as Sheikh Qaradawi would say, became human shields, and they took beatings, and their nonviolent presence as victims of settler assault would force the otherwise passive Israeli Defense Force in the neighborhood to intervene and protect both the Israeli peace activists and the Arab villagers. The issue here for the ultra-right Israeli religious nationalist is stealth ethnic cleansing, making life on the land unbearable for impoverished Arab villagers who often had already lost much of their land to the settlers. The Israeli peace activists, the Jews, were doing more to preserve a Palestinian presence on Palestinian land than 99% of all the Arabs. The response to this is no response. Little or nothing of this story, which has gone on for several years now at the time of the annual olive harvest, has appeared in the Arab press. To the honor of the Jerusalem Bureau of El Arabiya, we have covered this story. And to the honor of one of my former journalism students at the American University in Cairo, who writes for major Arab media, this story has appeared at least once, possibly twice, in the Cairo press. That's it. This story is not convenient to Arab media, which embraces and at times incites the street's take on Palestine. Of course, if the issue is domestic, a question that concerns the large Coptic Orthodox Christian community in Egypt and their relations with the Muslims, or even by chance involves one of the handful of Egyptian Jews remaining, then we will read in the Egyptian state media about the heavenly religions, meaning Christianity and Judaism as well as Islam. There are other no-go topics when media and religion intertwine. Having read all I can about Pope Benedict, I think what one can say is that he, more than his successor, wants a dialogue that he has described as frank, as well as friendly with Muslim religious leaders and with Arab and other Muslim governments. That dialogue has to do with the issue of reciprocity. European Muslims, backed up by the Arab and Muslim states, have clamored for and received permission to build big central mosques in Rome, London, and Washington, D.C. And to a large degree, these mosques have been generously funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, among the many donors. But until now, no church may be built in Saudi Arabia, nor until a year ago could one be built in Qatar. This is not an issue that will ever be raised by most Arab media. The Arab press is furious about the slightest fault or injury or discrimination that befalls the Muslim in Europe and America, particularly since 9/11, when backlash has taken its toll. And new procedures administered at times by mindless airport security officials, particularly in this country, has led to bizarre harassment and hardship for some Muslims having nothing to do with terrorism. But there is little or no sense of equity, of equivalence, of an elementary quid pro quo, as in the case of church building in Arabia and mosque building in Rome. Indeed, often the opposite is the rule. A few years ago, and not too long after 9/11, the Egyptian managing editor of the student newspaper at the American University in Cairo, AUC, flew to New York. This young lady, like most Egyptian women, is a mahagaba. She wears a large scarf over her head and around her neck, which, despite the worst fears of some uninformed Americans, does not in any way indicate participation or even support for any Islamist movement. For most women who choose to put on the hijab, the head veil if you want, it's a question of simple piety or at worst public conformity in the wake of a very broad religious revival underway in Egypt since 1967, and now reaching into the ranks of many highly westernized upper middle class Egyptian youth whose older sisters would not have worn the hijab. At JFK Airport, she breezed through customs and security, and just outside the gates, she was greeted by a reporter and a photographer representing one of the two main Egyptian newspapers. The reporter greeted the student and asked if she had been hassled in any way or inconvenienced by the Homeland Security people at passport control or at customs. She said, no, not at all. The news team looked at each other and went off in search of another would-be victim. What impresses me about American media, and I have only been reading it or watching it in a reasonably comprehensive manner since I left Cairo 7 months ago, Cairo's been my home for the past 30 years, is its intrinsic decency when injustices appear to have been done to Muslims solely because they appear to be Muslim. Muslim names, a Middle Eastern look, a beard, a head veil. These stories get reported here in the American press. Aside from the Islamophobe margins of our media, and most of that media, what I've called Islamophobe, is online, not in print or broadcasting. Aside from that marginal grouping, Muslims get a fair break in these stories. And then there are positive stories, like the case of the Justice Department intervening as a friend of the court on behalf of a Muslim student who was suing a school district that barred her entry into her classes because she was wearing a head veil, because she was in hijab. The Justice Department intervened in the case on her behalf because they saw the exclusion as a violation of the First Amendment right to practice one's religion. I tried tracking that story in Arab media, and to my knowledge, it never appeared, at least in the Egyptian press. The Washington Bureau functions as El Arabiya's national bureau. And since I've been here, we've produced stories about the first American Muslim woman to be invested as a judge in the state of Michigan and perhaps in the entire United States, of the unsuccessful but impressive run in a Republican primary in Texas of a young Saudi American who got nearly 40% of the vote, with barely any Muslim voters in his constituency. And most recently, an interfaith unity march in Washington, the day before the anniversary of 9/11. A march that began with a Muslim call to prayer in Arabic, being chanted by a Muslim in a central synagogue in our capital. And a march that ended with 2 Jewish cantors singing a Hebrew hymn at the central mosque. All of that picture, with sound bites from a rabbi and an Arabic-speaking imam, both of whom were in the first row of this march, both explaining why this most unusual story for our Arab viewers, 33 million of them, was so typical of America. These are the sort of stories we've been doing at El Arabiya, along with all the customary hard political news we must cover like anybody else, because it's a major part of the truth about America. And our motto at El Arabiya is getting closer to the truth. Why are such stories so unusual? They're true and deserving of recognition, regardless how the Arab and Islamic world perceives American policy in Iraq or towards Iran or towards Israel. Accuracy is part of truth. One might say it's the very beginning of truth, of getting things right, for it's easier to be accurate than to be able to perceive complex truth. Yet I have always been amazed at the casual attitude towards the importance of accuracy in so much of the Arab press. And here's the third point. The Arab media's sloppiness applies to everyone. They don't discriminate. It's a universal credo. Indeed, the Mufti of Egypt, one of the highest-ranking religious figures in Cairo, almost invariably must spend time and energy clarifying and correcting the misquotes and the invented quotes that so often appear whenever he's interviewed by the Egyptian press. And then to add insult to injury, by the way, his articles at times are translated into English by memory, a translation service of Arab media founded and headed up by a retired Israeli intelligence officer, and with extraordinary reach in this country. I've spoken in English at the Egyptian Council for Foreign Relations, and I received phone calls of congratulations for my remarks, which were written up in the leading newspaper, El Ahram. Now, when I had those remarks translated, the sentiments reportedly expressed were fine, but they weren't my sentiments, they weren't mine. All of my quotes had been made up by the reporter. All right, perhaps in that case, the reporter could not afford a translator. But another time, another reporter interviewed my management assistant in Arabic, since I wasn't available. The interview appeared in full in a respectable newspaper, and it was attributed entirely to me. Now to the fourth point. Such disregard for facts and for accuracy is profoundly un-Islamic. In theory, if modern media had arisen organically in the Arab world, deriving its style and values from within traditional Arab Islamic culture, it would have been perhaps the most obsessively accurate and objective media that the modern world would have known. That is because in Islam, the word is paramount. The word is paramount. It is the Quran, which is the cosmic equivalent of the Christ in traditional Christian understanding. Not the Prophet Muhammad. It's the Quran, which is the equivalent of the Christ, who is the vessel of this revelation. In other words, the Prophet Muhammad isn't the revelation. He's the vessel of this revelation, and whose life is a commentary on this revelation, but not the revelation itself, as in the case of the Christ, who is the living revelation. It's the Quran, or the uniquely, perfectly preserved revelation, which would be the textual equivalent of immaculate, existing through eternity, not made or created, as in the rationalist terminology in the classical period debate as to the nature of the Quran, which took place in Baghdad many, many, many centuries ago, when Baghdad was a center of humane thought and behavior. A debate that the rationalists lost. So the Quran is the word of God made word, as the Christ is the word of God made flesh, which by definition is a pictorial event. You follow me? In other words, we understand the word made flesh, Christ's life, Christ's passion, in visual or pictorial terms. The word is word. It's not so much that Islam is iconoclastic, quite the contrary. It's that its icons, its representations of the sacred inner essence of all things are oral rather than visual or pictorial. In Islam, the manuscript or the calligraphed Quran is a rendering of the sound of the original recitation, of a sacred recitation granted to the prophet by the angel Gabriel, the same angel who announces to the Virgin Mary that she is the chosen vessel for the coming of the Word made flesh. But how to interpret the Quran? It contains, along with all the names and attributes of God, such as Ar-Rahman, the most merciful, Ar-Rahim, the most compassionate, Al-Haq, the truth or the reality, Al-Hayy, the ever-living, names and attributes as to the nature of God, which are at the core of the mystical dimension of Islam known as Sufism. But it's also in its expository form, a guide to prayer, to purification of body and soul, and to social relationships. For the Muslims, the Prophet's life and his sayings is a sacred commentary, the interpretation of the word. The Quran tells the Muslim to maintain prayer. The Hadith, which are the verified sayings of the Prophet, tell the Muslim that means to perform canonic prayer 5 times a day, and how to prepare for that prayer and how to perform those prayers. Indeed, the time, manner of the prayer, and the content of canonic prayer has not varied since the time of the Prophet. And the language of prayer remains in the language of revelation, Arabic. Even though the majority of Muslims in the world, all of whom recite their prayers in Arabic, do not understand Arabic. Imagine an American Muslim. All right, imagine me. I could parachute into the most obscure village in Sumatra, Indonesia, and be able to immediately join in and either follow or even lead canonic prayer. It's an example of how profoundly Catholic, if I may mix my metaphors, how conservative and how ritualistic Islam is, revolutionary Muslims, Islamists, and modernist Muslims to the contrary. So it became imperative in the earliest years of the Islamic community, after the passing of the Prophet and his companions, to accurately assemble canonic collections as to every certified statement of the Prophet. The collection of these reports, or news about the Prophet's own words, known as the Hadith literature, constitute a sacred news. The key lay in what modern journalists describe as sourcing, tracing any given hadith back to the Prophet and the person who actually heard the Prophet speak, through a chain of reputable sources, which meant a reputation for truthfulness and moral rectitude. This was particularly necessary in an age of faith, such as the earliest centuries after the Prophet, because political struggles among the Muslims in that age of faith was inevitably colored by religious justification, and the temptation to forgery, to invent politically useful hadith, must have been great. With all of this as background, one might then assume that the practice of journalism in the Muslim world, and particularly in the Arabic-speaking cultural core of the Muslim world, would be the modicum of soul-searching honesty, decency, and above all, of painstaking accuracy and sourcing, inspired by these indigenous values. There are positive values to be found in the practice of Arab journalism. There's an aversion to blasphemy. Aside from the polemical, radical Islamist press, Arab journalists do not blaspheme God or any of his prophets. And aside from the Islamist press, particularly when it's engaged in diatribes against the Jews, the editors of Arab media do not blaspheme the other heavenly religions. But it's precisely in the area of accuracy, of reliable sourcing, of the veracity of information that Arab media, and particularly Arabic language press, can be scandalous. Now to my last point. That is, if you're still with me. How to understand this dichotomy. How to explain why the Arab media seems adverse not only to the broader canons of journalism, but also to the Muslim heritage that insists on the accuracy of the word. Well, when the printing press came to the Arab world, it did not do so within an organic development. It was brought by the sword, specifically by Napoleon's brief but profoundly important defeat of the Mamluk dynasty and his conquest of Egypt. Napoleon retreated, but the printing press remained, along with the idea of France as the gateway to modernity, or at least to the technology of survival in the contemporary world. Conceivably, an organic development into an authentic Arab Islamic journalism honoring accuracy might have arisen in the wake of the late 18th century Hadith revival that swept the Muslim world. And it was particularly noticeable, this Hadith revival, in Egypt, given Cairo's prestige as a gathering place for scholars clustered in and about Al-Azhar University. Now, this Hadith revival, like the late 18th century Sufi reform movements, was a religious and spiritual response within orthodoxy, within the tradition, to the shambles of a religious culture in such a state of protracted, tensionless equilibrium that degeneration is inevitable. I mean, imagine a culture like a human being. If you're tensionless and in total equilibrium, you know, you're not moving, degeneration, no matter how great the original physique is inevitable. That wasn't in my text. I just thought you'd like the Hadith revival asserted the direct and clear speech of the Prophet and his companions in comparison to the overly formal, overly stylistic, overly embellished court Arabic. But the Hadith revival had barely begun when the Napoleonic conquest occurred. And any number of scholars who prior to the conquest would have been drawn into the ranks of the Hadith revival were now trying instead to come to grips with the demoralizing implications for a military defeat in the very heartland of Islam, for a religious civilization that had until then known only triumph, however qualified. The loss of Spain or of Sicily, offset by the Ottoman conquest in the Balkans. The conquest of the Crusaders, offset by the Muslim conquest of India and the successful counter-crusade. With religious thought in disarray and the technology of the printing press in place, this mid-19th century void was soon to be filled by the more westernized Arabs from Syria and Lebanon, many of whom were Christian, in contact with modern French culture, and influenced by the aggressively laic, if not agnostic quality to much of the 19th century Parisian press, or for that matter, the 20th century Parisian press. Instead of Hadith, with its rigorous insistence on sourcing and accuracy, and its almost impersonal quest for objectivity, the secular and often non-Muslim pioneers of Arab journalism were drawn to the belles lettres tradition within Arabic literature, what we call adab literature. Essays, which had more to do with literary flourish and self-expression, more to do with opinion and with literary stance than with accuracy and sourcing. and more to do with the writer's opinion of an event and his interpretation of the event than the facts of the event itself. This tendency was deeply reinforced by the French continental perception of news as a vehicle for analysis, and very often a most partisan or ideological analysis, rather than news or information as an objective in itself. This tendency contrasts to the ultimate Anglo-American model, which in its mercantile rather than revolutionary origins sought accuracy and objectivity, if only for utilitarian reasons. You know, you got to know the price of gold, regardless of your politics. From the merchant's perspective, the need for fast, accurate information about shifting prices of commodities or changing political conditions affecting trade and stability. It paid to get it right. Now, such a utilitarian perspective operated on a far different dimension than the search for veracity, for the love of God, and in fear and trembling. But in the end, a rigorous sacred journalism and a utilitarian need for accuracy and truth would have married well. But by the time the British assumed first partial and then full imperial authority in Egypt, the late 19th century, French cultural domination in Egypt and much of the Levant was secure, and the unique character of the Arabic language press was already defined. So the French are to be blamed. Not entirely. Let's not forget the rise of Republican nationalist socialist police states and their Soviet mentors in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, the vital players in the Middle East state system, and the nationalization of the press, which was now in the service of the whims of the ruling party, rather than the whims of the journalists and former publishers. That confirmed this trend. The printed word, particularly in the service of journalism and political exposition, became more irresponsible than ever. At the same moment, it became more servile. Arab television, which came into being during the high tide of Republican police states, did not even, and you know what I mean by Republican, I'm not talking about our president, I'm talking about, you know, anti-monarchist movements, political movements that overthrew the kings of Iraq and Egypt, all right? Please, let's get this right. Its photographers covered only occasions of state. There were no accompanying correspondence, since it was what we euphemistically call information, not news, that was sought. Anchors could do the job of reading state news agency wire copy describing these ceremonial occasions, while unedited footage of these occasions were transmitted. It was all very disconnected. Onto this dismal scene came something new, an odd product of the first war against Saddam Hussein, and believe it or not, some hope. Bear with me a little longer. Arab satellite television, inspired by CNN International's coverage of the 1991 Gulf War and the lengthy buildup and political drama in the region following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, changed all that. Suddenly, a new cadre of Arab journalists, inspired by CNN and trained by the BBC, by Anglo-American journalism, were hosting open debate talk shows on the Orbit network, broadcasting from Rome, an Arabic network broadcasting from Rome, but watched all over the Arab world, and field reports for lively news bulletins on the pioneer channel NBC, followed by a short-lived experiment of an all-news BBC Arabic television service, both broadcasting from London. All of these strands were pulled together with the launch of Al Jazeera from Qatar, at the center of which, setting standards for this 24/9 news channel, were a core of BBC-trained journalists. So you see, I'm blaming the British also. From the beginning, Al Jazeera has exhibited a sort of dual nature. Its head, disciplined by BBC training, CNN example, and the desire of professional journalists to practice a free journalism and open debate. But Al Jazeera's heart is, to varying degrees, depending on the individuals and the managerial fashions, shaped by twin ideological currents, Arab nationalism and Islamism. These two ideological currents, it seemed, to have best survived in the virtual Arab nation that politically aware exiles and expatriates so easily inhabit abroad, outside of the Arab world. It was Al Jazeera that could simultaneously interview Israelis, something unheard of in Arab journalism, and provide wide-ranging public affairs forums for even-handed debate, and then during Intifada II and the war in Afghanistan, seemingly go out of its way to incite hysteria in the Arab street. Hence, the appearance of El Arabiya on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, promising a more detached, more professional brand of journalism. And the competition between these two all-news channels stimulated reform and improvements in state TV news programming, particularly in Egypt, Jordan, and Abu Dhabi. Although much of the improvements in the government channels tend to be cosmetic. Nevertheless, by the year 2005, Bernard Lewis could note in an article in Foreign Affairs that Arab satellite television brings to the people of the Middle East a previously unknown spectacle, that of lively and vigorous public disagreement and debate. As Al Arabiya has found firm footing in the past few years, and under the leadership of a new general manager, Abdurrahman al-Rashid, the former editor-in-chief of the lively London-based Arabic daily newspaper Sharq al-Awsat, which is satellited to the Arab world, Al Arabiya has taken on an increasingly distinctive look in which professionalism will always trump ideology. In the 1930s, one talked about the premature anti-fascists. Abdurrahman is an example of the premature Arab anti-terrorist. It was he who wrote so courageously in one of the first examples of post-9/11 contemporary Arab self-criticism more than 2 years ago, when large segments of the Arab public were still in denial. And he wrote, quote, "If the majority of Muslims are not terrorists, the majority of terrorists are Muslims." If Al Jazeera cultivates Islamist sentiment by showcasing Muslim brother Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi with his own talk show, and by producing and broadcasting documentaries that are clearly inspired by an Islamist perspective, Al Arabiya insists, Abdurrahman, deals with Islamism or political Islam only in the context of reporting upon any significant political development in the Arab world. It's not a cheerleader. Al Arabiya is not a cheerleader. Al Arabiya also refused to use the word martyr to describe the death of militant combatants, be they suicide bombers in Palestine or Sunni insurgents in Iraq battling American forces or murdering Shiite civilians. This policy has borne fruit. Al Jazeera no longer uses the word in its newscasts except when describing Palestinians killed by Israeli gunfire or bombs. There are other interesting countervailing trends. NBC, the satellite network that owns Al Jazeera, has been broadcasting the programs of Hamza Yusuf, a young American Muslim scholar and da'i. Da'i means caller to Islam. Hamza speaks flawless Arabic, and his perspective has been shaped by years of study in the Arab world with Sufi sheikhs. He speaks against the sort of unthinking rage that characterizes so much of popular protest in the Arab world, a rage he admits he once cultivated on many occasions until 9/11 brought him to his senses. Hamza Yusuf has a great following among educated Arab youth. Other private satellite channels have also started, so to speak, to counter-program al-Qaradawi, and the hundreds of even more vituperative Salafite or Wahhabi sheikhs who justify violence and invoke rage as some sort of valid religious sentiment in mosques across the Arab world and in Europe. Now, the most popular of the callers of da'i is Amr Khalid, who attracted large followings of obviously educated and middle-class Egyptians to his talks at mosques and in hotel ballrooms, and more recently on his own television show carried by Iqra Channel. His message encourages orthodoxy married to compassion, as was traditionally the case. He's generally indifferent to the sort of political issues that Islamist preachers thrive on. There's still others, like Hamza Yusuf and Amr Khalid, young men such as the Egyptian Muaz Massoud and the Yemeni Habib el-Jifri, who have surfaced in recent years with a similar message of personal piety, the cultivation of a compassionate soul, and the practice of religion for the sake of ethical and spiritual realization, rather than as a militant ideology, also broadcasting on Iqra and in Abu Dhabi satellite channels. An entire new channel launched by the Saudi master entrepreneur, Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, precisely to be a voice of religious moderation, has become still another vehicle for these young da'i, whose impact on the young Muslims seems to vindicate the theory or the thesis of Rabbi Mark Gopin, who suggested in a recent article published in the Christian Science Monitor that the antidote to religious extremism wherever and whatever denominational form it takes, is not the emptiness of secularism, but the viable and proven alternative of religious compassion. During the disturbances over the Danish cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad, these young television dai urged dialogue with the Danes rather than confrontation. And back in the world of Arab television journalism, it was the issue of the Danish cartoons that Al Arabiya's different approach to broadcast news became apparent. Al Jazeera and other channels played to and thereby incited the Arab street. Al Arabiya interviewed the Danish prime minister and allowed him to make his own case against the campaign by the Arab states and much of Arab media to impose collective punishment upon Denmark, upon its government, its export industry, and its people. Again, the irony was lost on most of the Arab media. This was precisely the same concept of collective punishment that all Arab media complain about when applied by the Israelis to the vast number of Palestinians in the occupied territories who had no dealings with terrorist organizations. Al Arabiya didn't just cover the violent attacks against Danish properties in the Arab world, it also interviewed Arab intellectuals who are highly critical of this sort of mindless response, as well as those advocating confrontation. Nabil Khatib, Al Arabiya's news editor, said that when the channel decided to report on the Danish cartoon controversy without playing to the hysteria in the Arab street, everyone assumed Al Arabiya would pay a price in a loss of viewers, and as a punishment for its objectivity and its refusal to pander to the Arab street. To everyone's surprise, Al Arabiya's ratings, particularly in the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Lebanon, nearly doubled during this period. Perhaps, Dr. Nabil suggested to me, when 2,000 or 3,000 Arabs demonstrate violently and hysterically in the streets of any Arab capital, we do wrong to assume they necessarily represent the views of the millions more who are not out there committing acts of violence and demonstrating the sort of rage that the Quran and the Prophet always caution the Muslims against. So let me sum it up. The media in the Arab Islamic world, by and large, have tended to aggravate a lot of political and religious pathologies through their disregard for truth and accuracy, a habit shaped by their literary and propagandist antecedents. But they have actually been the least faithful to Islam's own standards, leading to dangerous distortions of this religion in the eyes of the world. Now, here comes the hope. Paradoxically, the CNN effect, by magnifying these very tendencies, has led to a counteraction. Such countervailing trends promise that the media in the Arab Islamic world will not only adhere more closely to standards of honesty and accuracy in the future, but in doing so will become more faithful to the demands of Islam itself. Perhaps that's the best news of all. Thank you.
I know we've run on a little longer than usual because we started late, so we'll give you the opportunity for a few questions. Please, if you'd come up and strangle the microphone. And the usual rule applies. If you have a question, ask it. If you have a speech, don't give it. Yes, sir.
Abdallah, thank you very much. I wonder what your assessment is, living in two worlds of the media coverage, particularly the Iraq War, that you view here.
Oh, you mean the coverage here by American media of the Iraq War? Well, you know, unfortunately, American coverage of the Iraq War sort of resembles Arab coverage of the Iraq War. And Arabs are the difference is that they do it to a great degree. In other words, they tend to just sort of cover the atrocious aspects of what's going on in Iraq. And that could either be from a sort of knee-jerk anti-Americanism or a genuine feeling that this was all a terrible mistake. We tend to do the same thing, but I think it has to do with an unfortunate news value that a big explosion killing 50 people, which really isn't telling us much more than the big explosion that killed 48 people the day before, that explosion is somehow more newsworthy than the context, which change all the time. I mean, I, for instance, noticed, you know, for 2 years, Iraqi Sunni insurgents have been murdering Shiite civilians. And for 2 years, the Shiites did nothing because of the extraordinary efforts of Ayatollah Sistani to keep them not to strike back. Well, it was a civil war then. The difference was only one side was fighting the civil war. And then when finally, because it just was getting too hopeless, after the Samarra mosque was blown, the Shiite mosque was blown, and at which point one of our correspondents was murdered by the same people who blew the mosque the next day, and her crew. You know, we've lost 11 people in the Al Arabiya covering that war. Anyway, then suddenly, Sistani loses control, and various Shia militias start their own counter death squatting. Suddenly, the press is talking about a civil war. Well, it's been going on for 2 years, but now it's sort of even. You know, the murders are being committed on both sides. And I think that sort of reflects, in the case of the Arab press, I know why. There's a problem of, unfortunately, most of the Arab world is Sunni, and there's a problem of anywhere, it's called the limits of empathy. So somehow, when the Arab media would talk about Iraq, they really meant the 20% of Iraq that's Arab Sunni, not the Kurds who are Sunni but not Arab, not the Shiites who are Arab but not Sunni. And so, because of the limits of empathy, Arab Sunnis empathizing, and a sort of triumphalism of what you could call Arab Sunni triumphalism, the coverage in the Arab world is skewed. Here it's skewed because of, as I said, we have to go for the big blast, even though the big blast tells us very little. It's just sort of gory entertainment, you know, to look at. So I think our coverage is poor, and I think some of the best coverage going on is in print, when you get people who are very courageous and have stayed there, and it's very difficult. Most of the coverage we're getting now that's good at all is being done by Iraqis, because Americans simply can't go out of the green zone. I hope that is useful.
Hello. Hi. I wanted to ask you about something about the Arab media that you have not mentioned, and that is the prevalence of conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And I've been in touch with a columnist, for example, who writes a lot in Arab papers, but he actually lives in Mumbai.
He's what?
He lives in Mumbai in India.
All right.
And recently there was the bombing of India, and he informed me that that was perpetrated by the Mossad. And I'm not talking about somebody from the street, I'm talking about a columnist.
Right.
So the issue is whether the people are just misrepresenting and being inaccurate, or they really believe in what they're actually saying and writing.
Do they?
Oh, well, you know, you've heard of the, I think the Arabs are like everybody else, but more so. I mean, you've heard of the arabesque, right? Where you start like this, and then it sort of curves out. So you have two identical, parallel curlicues as an artistic direction. And that's sort of the mind. So the mind simultaneous will, and actually you don't have to be an Arab to get that. You just smoke a lot of hashish, and you get that. But anyway, and it is very artistic. There's something very beautiful and artistic about that. But the problem is, when carried over into life, it means that people can entertain simultaneously two contradictory perspectives. One will be almost, look, there's something very attractive about conspiracy theories, because if the world is in the hands of 16 old Jews with beards called the Elders of Zion, and they're running everything, well, there's nothing to be done. It's hopeless. You know, just sit and complain about it. So conspiracy theory is a very attractive thing if you are relatively powerless, because it provides a quick, easy synopsis that allows you to do nothing, when doing something would be very difficult, all right? And conspiracy theory has other attractions too. It provides a Manichaean worldview, black and white, no grays. But we know the difficulty of trudging our way through a world full of various gradations. At the same time, there's another part. Look, so when I came to the Arab world first in the 60s, 1960s, on one hand, everybody would listen to Abdel Nasser or Mohammed Hassan Hakel on the radio, you know, saying the most extraordinary things, like on the first day of the June 6th war, that the entire Israeli Air Force had been eliminated. At the same time, and believing it. And at the same time, listening to BBC radio because there was another part of you that knew that Arab radio lied in its teeth. All right? So this is the fascinating thing about understanding. And of course, to believe that Mossad did it or the CIA did it is a way of denying painful realities. You know, when, again, I think it has to do with societies that have been conquered and mastered. So you go into denial. When those airplanes hit the World Trade Center, right, the automatic reaction of Arabs, Muslims would be, it can't be us. My reaction, I'm an American Muslim. I haven't been colonized. I haven't been conquered. I'm one of the masters of the universe. My reaction was to pray, Ya God, please let it not be a Muslim. Like my grandfather probably used to pray, let it not be a Jew. Okay? So that's another aspect of conspiracy theory, that it's a way of denial. And denial is a big capital D letter in any society that feels itself to be deprived or victimized or having an identity problem.
Sir.
Could you give us a little description of the financial structure of your station in Al Jazeera, if you know it, who invests in it, and also the technology? How's it broadcast? Do you take it down on a satellite dish, or some of the financial and technological structure of?
Sure. First of all, it's carried, both the channels are carried in America with a couple other Arab channels. They're on DishNet. I think that's what it's called, which is a satellite service. You have to pay a premium fee to get sort of like an ethnic ghetto, but you can get a bunch of Arab channels. Financing. The model for Jazeera was sort of the BBC. I mean, on a theoretical plane, i.e., money that originates from the state, in this case, probably the private purse of the Emir of Qatar and some of his very close family members who play a role in the board of directors. But at the same time, Al Jazeera is supposed to have independence. Now, it's not quite the same model. The BBC makes it with a tax. It's not directly dependent. Every Englishman is taxed for your TV set. That pays for BBC. There's heavy advertising. Jazeera does not get heavy advertising. It's been boycotted by people who are afraid they'll offend Saudi Arabia, which has suffered from some of the reports of Al Jazeera. So you could say the ultimate financing of Al Jazeera, unlimited checks written by the Emir of Kuwait or his closest relatives. And Qatar. And Qatar is doing very well. It's doing fantastically well. It has the highest per capita of anybody in the world today, if you just count the Qataris, because of natural gas, petroleum. It's just doing spectacularly well. Arabiya, on the contrary, is a privately owned by a Saudi businessman. Now, there are allegations that there are ties to the ruling clique or class or whatever you want to call it in Saudi Arabia. Possibly those stories circulate because the Saudi businessman who owns us happens to be the brother-in-law of the late King Fahd. All right, but he's not a prince. He's Sheikh Walid. He's not a prince. He's not a member of the royal family. He is a businessman, and we are run as a business. We operate, I can tell you, in Washington, D.C., Al Jazeera outguns us 2 to 3 to 1 in reporters and correspondents, in budgets. He is a businessman. He expects his properties to turn a profit. Some of them do. We don't. And it's a struggle for our budget. Does that answer? Who was asking the question?
Yeah. How many employees does your...
Oh, you mean the whole operation?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, we've got our bureau is one of the biggest. We have a big bureau in Jerusalem. I just can't estimate. It's a couple hundred. But again, Jazeera has more than we do. And we're part of a network, what's called the NBC Group, which consists of a general channel, like American Network, a mixture of news, variety, a children's channel, 2 very popular entertainment channels, one showing American movies, one showing American sitcoms, and us. And the others make money. I don't know about the children's channel, but the others make money. We don't. But we're doing all right.
Yes, sir.
It has been said that what is going on now is, rather than being a clash of civilization, East versus West or Christian versus Muslim, that a more important dimension is the division within Islam, that in a way it's a civil war, a religious reformation, counter-reformation going on within Islam. Would you comment?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. I think that is that, and certainly, you know, terrible as the deaths have been on 9/11 in this country, the number of Arabs, the number of Muslims that have been killed by Al-Qaeda, like far outnumber in the thousands. Yeah, it is a civil war.
Okay, I think we'll get, then you'll be the last.
Okay. Perhaps you could explain to us why we have had no debate about Osama bin Laden's proposal for peace between Islam and the rest of the world. He has said in his fatwa, get out of here, stay out of here, we'll leave you alone. When I say to anybody, that's not a bad idea. Let's get out of there. Let's get them out of here. Let's do like the Treaty of Lausanne. And let's swap.
You're going to deport me to Saudi Arabia?
Well,
Me
absolutely.
to Saudi Arabia?
I'm not kidding you. Absolutely. This will bring peace.
Okay.
Everybody's got to switch sides.
Yeah, he'll comment on that.
We'll comment on that?
Yeah.
Well, number one, if you understand the vision of, I'm not talking about the grassroots. You see, it is true that on a grassroots level, a lot of our stuff in the Middle East does generate support for Osama bin Laden. A lot of that support he squandered by some of the things he's done, like picking a battle in Saudi Arabia. Suddenly the Saudi attitude towards Osama changes when he starts shooting them. Or Jordan, when he blows up, you know, when his people, the Iraqi branch of Al-Qaeda, blow up Jordanian hotels. But the point is that, sure, on a grassroots level, a lot of support for terrorism would evaporate if we just sort of withdrew, although I'm sure a lot of people would blame us for that too. That comes with the territory when you're a world power. You get blamed no matter what you do. But in terms of the vision that he and Ayman, his number two, have, I mean, I think that's just that's just a clever tactical ploy on his part. He sees himself as leading a world revolutionary movement. And he didn't just shift. You know, originally what we call the Salafi jihadis, you know, they were focusing entirely on Arab countries. All the energies went into terrorism in Egypt. Egypt fought a major counterinsurgency all through the 80s. A lot of people died before they crushed it. That was true elsewhere. Then, because for different reasons, they switched to the farther enemy, what's called the farther enemy, the United States. Now, from a polemical point of view, our Middle East policy lends itself a lot to the polemics against us. But that isn't the only reason. The objective is, if they can really get the United States out, then their vanguard organization, they use terminology like that, which comes from a sort of right-wing Leninism, which is known as fascism. Their vanguard, disciplined, tough, ready to self-sacrifice, will overthrow all the moderate Arab regimes. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's it. And then from there on to other great nihilistic, death-defying, that sort of remind you of the ambitions of the Third Reich. So I don't know if I would have trusted Hitler if he had offered me a deal.
You'll have the last.
Thank you so much for your stimulating and illuminating lecture. I'd like to draw you out on a question of your assessment of the significance of American popular culture through the entertainment media. I was in Istanbul a few months ago, and I had a discussion over dinner with a very interesting young journalist, Mustafa Akyol. And he commented on what an impact the showing of Little House on the Prairie had been maybe 20 years ago. He said this show, he claimed, had made a big impact on the way that Turks of all sorts, and particularly pious Turks, viewed America. And he commented that in recent times, the kind of popular culture that came across into Turkey was very offensive. And one can imagine if America is represented by Baywatch to relatively pious parents, that there would be some issues there. And I don't know what the solution to that would be, but I'd like to simply draw you out on the degree to which you think this is or is not an issue.
I had the same reaction in the Arab world as your Turkish friend did in Turkey. That show 20 years ago was extraordinary. And indeed, people could, I'll tell you something else, people could identify with it. Very much so, because it represented a different America, a more conservative America, an America consumed by family values, and yet it was very sweet. There wasn't, nobody was blowing up abortion clinics in that film, you know, so it had a sweetness to it, while at the same time it was conservative and pious and loving and friendly. You know, and these things happen. My wife is Sudanese. You know, the movie she most identifies with as someone from a very conservative Sudanese family, Fiddler on the Roof. She thinks it's about a bunch of white Muslims living in Eastern Europe, you know? Yes, the cultural programs like that, and science, and education, these are all very positive. As for the other dimension of American culture, mass culture, what sometimes I call it MTV culture, it's problematic because on one hand there is a constituency for it. It's a narrow constituency. It's usually pretty well off, upper middle class, alienated kids, but it's large. At the same time, yes, it is profoundly offensive. And not just to the Muslims. I mean, I'm sure there are millions and millions of Americans, conservative Christians and Jews, who are deeply offended by the sort of promiscuous values that you will find flaunted. I mean, practice is one thing. I mean, people have been, you know, carrying on for thousands of years, but to flaunt it as a public virtue, as so much of our popular culture does, and in many ways is responsible for sort of the fundamental, you know, that's one of the sources of militant fundamentalism, when they sort of get that stuff in their face over and over again, and it destabilizes you, you know? So it's a problem, and you've put your finger on it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.